history in Northeast Asia from an international relations perspective. I'll say a little by way of introduction for this session, and then we will turn to our presenters. We have 4, and each will speak for 10 minutes. And then we will have 3 discussants, and they will speak for about 8 minutes each. And then we'll have time for a wider discussion among our group and questions from the audience. The first thing I want to say is talking about the historical memory issue in East Asia involving China, Japan, South Korea, and sometimes other countries sounds like a broken record. This is a frequent theme, comes up over and over again, and some may be asking, well, what are we going to say that's new? And some say, the less said, the better. If we stop talking about the issue, maybe it'll go away. Well, that is not our approach today. We think we have something new to say, and the organizers of this Peace Forum obviously have confidence in us and in this theme, and now we must make a strong case for why linking history and international relations is worth doing and important for trying to achieve better relations in this region. I will start by saying a few things about why I think this matters. First thing is I regard historical memory as a subcategory of national identity. And national identity changes, and it can be influenced by what goes on, including attitudes towards other countries. It has an impact on how historical memory is conceived. So that's the first thing, put it in a broader framework. Next, I would say that national identity has to be broken down into various dimensions. And I would list historical memory, the temporal dimension, as one of the dimensions for understanding national identity. And we have to see how other dimensions are changing in order to make better sense of historical memory. Ideological dimensions, sectoral dimensions dealing with cultural identity, political identity, economic identity, also dimensions dealing with international relations seen through different circles, and the degree of depth in in national identity and domestic vertical dimensions within a society. Another point I would raise, as one I think matters, is that the United States is part of the historical memory discussion in East Asia, increasingly so. It's a primary concern, and maybe in some ways some of the discussion will be shifting towards the United States as it's been shifting more towards China. So I would argue as a starting point that we need to refocus our discussion of bilateral relations, put them in a broader context of national identities, the role of the United States, and some changing aspects of international relations. So what I hope we can come up with in our discussions today is some sense of what this broader framework would look like. I start then by turning to our most historically oriented presenter. I will not introduce our speakers but beyond just saying who they are, but I'm very pleased that Donald Baker is here and will lead off our discussion.
Thank you for introducing me. I am an historian, and I am going to talk about history wars, debates over history. And I'll begin by repeating something that the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Elie Wiesel, said about 2 months ago. He spoke at a former Nazi concentration camp and said, "Memory must bring people together rather than set them apart. Memory is here not to sow anger in our hearts, but on the contrary, a sense of solidarity with all those who need us." But unfortunately, memory, especially collective memories, don't always serve that purpose. They often provide grounds for argument. and I have personal experience with that. I teach an introduction to Asian history at my university, and I have students from China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, many places, and often my students get angry at me because I teach a version of history that's different from what they heard from their parents and grandparents. Why do they become angry? Because that challenges their sense of identity. As we just heard, one aspect of your identity, both your personal identity and your national identity, is your history. And when I challenge the way they think the history should be told, my students become upset. And I've tried to come up with ideas to help them understand different ways of approaching history, and I'm going to introduce some of those ideas today. It seems to me particularly appropriate that we are meeting here in Jeju Island to talk about the impact of memory wars, history wars, on self and community identity. And many of you here are Koreans. You probably know that Jeju had a particularly tragic history in the 1940s. Before the Korean War broke out, there was a civil war here on this island. Probably 1 out of every 10 inhabitants of Jeju Island died between 1948 and 1953. 30,000 people out of 300,000. It was Jeju Islander against Jeju Islander. How do you commemorate that kind of memory? Because both descendants of both sides still live here. They could not talk about it legally for 50 years. Only in shaman rituals was it discussed. Now they can talk about it. And yesterday, I went to a brand new museum, opened last year, called the April 3rd Museum. This episode began on April 3rd, 1948. And it was interesting. They managed to present the story of what happened in a way that both sides could come away saying, they've been relatively fair to us. It was a very difficult balancing act. If Jeju can do that, so can the rest of us. If within this island they can come to terms with the bitter past. Let me just stop a minute and give you one example how bitter it was. A few years ago, I was visiting Jeju, and I was in a village here and talking to a man my age, and I said to him, were you here in 1948? He said, yes. I said, what happened? He looked at me and said, every adult male in my village was killed. And yet they've overcome those memories. They haven't forgotten them, but they now can live together. So, now, when I teach history, I find two areas that students want to argue about. My area is actually 18th, 19th century. They don't care about that. What they care about is ancient history and 20th century history. Those are the two areas I argue about. Ancient history, why? There is such little data that it's very easy for different sides to say the data supports them. Okay? And also I'll talk in a minute about anachronistic label being imposed. Modern history they argue about because they've heard things from their parents and grandparents. Okay? And how can I contradict what their parents and grandparents who lived through that period tell them? If I want to have a quiet class, I talk about medieval history. Nobody cares. And I should add that I have personal experience trying to deal with modern history because Koreans will know what I mean when I say I was in the city of Gwangju in May 1980 when there was a coup d'etat that killed, official figure 280, probably 1,000 unarmed civilians were killed in the city of Gwangju in 1980. And how do we talk about that incident? Mm-hmm. Now, I don't have much time, so let me look at ancient history first. Okay? The Japanese and the Koreans have often argued about the southeastern corner of Korea. Japanese have claimed sometimes that there was a Japanese political presence in the southeastern corner they call Mimana. That was one of their excuses for absorbing Korea into the Japanese empire at the beginning of the 20th century. Koreans argue, no way that was a Japanese political entity. It was a Korean confederation, now some say kingdom, called Kaya. Okay. So which was it? Was it Mimana or was it Kaya? Okay. Most Japanese now don't talk about Mimana much anymore, but you can go to Wikipedia and you'll still see Japanese saying that was Japanese territory. Let me suggest what I say to my students about resolving that. To talk about this Kaya region, which was absorbed into a Korean kingdom of Shilla in the 6th century, to talk about that as either Korean or Japanese 1,600 years ago appears to me to be anachronistic. There was no one Korea then, nor was there one Japan. It seems to me the people in southeastern Korea had much in common with peoples in southern Japan. Later on, the peoples in southeastern Korea became part of Korea. Their cousins in southern Japan became Japanese. That was later. To call them Koreans and Japanese 1,600 years ago is anachronistic. It's imposing contemporary labels on a past where it doesn't belong. If we can do that, then we can stop arguing about whether it was Korean or Japanese, because it was neither. Although we can admit Kaya became part of Korean history. What about the memory wars with Korea and China? We had a meeting at UBC, my university, British Columbia, last summer between Chinese, North Korean, and South Korean scholars to discuss an ancient kingdom called Goguryeo that went out of existence in the 7th century. Goguryeo governed territory that is mostly northeastern China now, but also the top third of the Korean peninsula. Koreans have claimed Goguryeo as Korean for millennia. In fact, one great Korean kingdom, Korea, took its name from Goguryeo. They simply dropped the middle syllable. And Koreans have had this, they talk about the 3 great kingdoms of Korea. Recently, in the last couple of decades, some Chinese scholars have started saying, no, Goguryeo was Chinese. It's proof that China has always been a multicultural empire, that Goguryeo was only a local government. How do we resolve this problem? And these are not just abstract debates, by the way. I've seen magazines in South Korea saying, recover our homeland, meaning northeastern China. Okay? So how do you resolve this? Again, was there one Korean people 1,600 years ago? No. The people of Goguryeo engaged in wars with the other inhabitants of the peninsula for 3 centuries. They didn't see themselves as one people. So to call Goguryeo Korean is anachronistic. But to call it Chinese is equally anachronistic. The people of Goguryeo had their own kingdom. There's a reason why China built a great wall south of Goguryeo. Right? It was not part of China. It was an independent kingdom. And so we should realize that they were not Koreans or Chinese, and that allows us to recognize that Goguryeo has contributed a lot to contemporary Korean civilization and culture. Goguryeo is part of what Korean people are today. At the same time, since that part of Northeast Asia has been part of China for a while, they also contributed to what became modern China. So both countries can claim that area as part of their history without excluding the other. That overcomes the debates. So we try to get away from these anachronistic use of contemporary political and ethnic labels, and now we'll hopefully turn down the temperature in these arguments. Now, what about in the modern period? The modern period debates get much more heated, as I've said, first of all, because you have people relying on maybe their own experience or the experience of their parents and grandparents. That's one reason. Also, there's a tendency in the modern era to blur intentions and consequences. If something bad happened, the people who caused it to happen must have had evil intentions. And therefore, when you recognize an unfortunate event in history, you want to blame somebody. Okay? Let me give you 2 examples here. There's the Koreans still debate or argue about the impact of Japanese colonial rule on Korea from 1910 to 1945. No one denies that in 1910 the Japanese took over what was an independent country of Korea. In 1945, the Japanese were forced out. Korea was a much different country. It had modern schools, modern hospitals, modern roads, and so on. Were the Japanese responsible for that modernization? Many Japanese would say, yes, we took this poor, backwards Korean country and modernized it. Many Koreans say, we modernized despite Japanese rule. Any modernization efforts Japanese did, they did to benefit Japan, not Koreans. Okay? How do we solve this dispute? Okay. Well, again, Koreans look at the Japanese coming to Korea and telling the Koreans, you are an inferior people, we will drag you into the modern world whether you want to or not. They're insulted by that, obviously. Therefore, they think anybody with that kind of arrogance could not do anything good. Okay? Japanese look at Korea and say in 1945, Korea had begun to modernize, therefore the Japanese must have been responsible for it, therefore they must have had good intentions. If you separate intentions from consequences, then you maybe can put aside the issue of whether the Japanese had good intentions or not and try to objectively examine what was Korea like in 1945 that made it so different from 1910. That would allow Koreans to objectively recognize that some benefits came to Korea in terms of modernization during the colonial period. It would also allow, if you set aside intentions and consequences, for some Japanese who want to say, we wanted to help Koreans, to recognize how the Koreans didn't appreciate being told they needed help, and allow the two sides to stop arguing about this. And this is a contemporary issue. Every time a Japanese politician say Koreans should be grateful, right, for what they did during the colonial period, Korea explodes in demonstrations. Another hot issue, this is my last one to bring up, the Nanjing massacre. 200 to 300,000 Chinese killed in Nanjing starting in December 1937 through spring 1938. Okay. Since the 1980s, the Chinese have built this up as proof of the evilness of the Japanese imperialism. It has become almost an attack on the Japanese people as somehow evil people. Some right-wing Japanese have responded by saying, we were simply in China to promote greater East Asia co-prosperity, and there's no way with those good intentions we could have killed that many people. How do you resolve that? Well, you can recognize that whatever the intentions were of the Japanese, people were killed in huge numbers in Nanjing. And on the Chinese side, you can recognize that people were killed in huge numbers, but maybe it was not the result of a deliberate policy of the Japanese government to slaughter Chinese in large numbers. A movie came out recently in China, A City of Life and Death, about Nanjing, and I'm told by the New York Times that the producer received death threats, the Chinese producer, because he showed some Japanese having some qualms about the large number of Chinese who were being killed. Many Chinese prefer to demonize the whole people. But if you can just forget about the intentions, look at what happened, then Japanese can recognize that maybe things got out of control and people died, even though the Japanese aren't an innately evil people. And Chinese can see a lot of people died, but maybe the Japanese weren't all evil. And then they can talk about the Nanjing massacre in maybe in a cooler atmosphere. So let me sum up by saying what we need to do in looking at the past, if you're dealing with the ancient past, back away from those anachronistic use of contemporary political and ethnic labels, like Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and in dealing with the 20th century, try to distinguish the intentions of historical actors and the consequences of those actors. Learn historical irony. Things don't always turn out the way people think they're going to in history. If we do that, it may provide a way for us to sit down and discuss these issues without getting into overheated discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. This presentation was very clear and made 2 points of advice for people to follow. And so right away, I think all of us will be asking, why isn't this advice being followed? So what is holding it up? And is it governments that don't want to follow this kind of advice? Or is it academics who deal with these history issues? And if academics want to follow the advice, does governments let them, or public opinion let them? So I hope we'll go further into depth in understanding what is the hang-up here. We turn now to our second presenter, Professor Chung Jae-ho from Seoul National University.
I'd like to thank the organizers for having me here, and I'd like to approach the same topic from international relations perspective. The popular perception was that before the end of the Cold War, once the Cold War was over, peace and stability would come. But in retrospective, that prediction was not quite correct, because the actual outcome of the end to the Cold War was not that straightforward. That is to say, although ideological confrontation has pretty much faded away, the world is now facing, once again, the traditional sources of interstate conflict, namely territorial, religious, and ethnic conflicts. And these traditional sources of interstate conflicts revolve around the key properties of national identities and consciousness, which are most explosive of all factors that affect international relations. During the Cold War era, the line between the friends and enemies was very clear. And since the ally-enemy distinction was transparent during the Cold War era, mutual learning occurred rather quickly, and learning was acted upon. But after 1991, all these lines got blurred, and new sources of interstate conflict resurfaced to affect international relations. And in my view, what makes the matter more complicated after the end to the Cold War is the spread of democratization and liberalization in some socialist states. Perceptions, reputations, national images, and public opinions in foreign policy making have all entered into a new phase. And also, in many societies, NGOs or societal forces have wielded increasingly strong influence in the making of foreign policy. And the diffusion of the internet and related technologies has created a huge space for ultra-nationalist appeal on the net. That is sometimes called nationalism, not NAT, but NET nationalism. All these developments are by no means favorable to the region of East Asia and Northeast Asia in particular. Because in Northeast Asia, as William Faulkner once said, the past is not dead, it's not even past, because the memories of the tragic past are still lingering in Northeast Asia. After over 60 years since the end of the Second World War, the region has not yet fully recovered from its painful memories. As Gary Gong once said, the fighting stories still abound across the region. Basically, as I see it, the problem in the region is twofold. One is the old wounds that hardly heal. The other one is the new scars in the making. By old wounds that hardly heal, I refer to the Sino-Japanese and Korean-Japanese discourse. As we all know, Northeast Asia is full of tragic histories and painful memories. You may point at one particular country for the problem, but in fact, the fundamental responsibility should be borne by all the parties concerned, who are more active in remembering than forgetting. More serious, I think, is the fact that emotions are mutually reinforcing. Let's say Japan often puts salt on old wounds. That creates strong forces of anti-Japan nationalism in China and South Korea, which in turn provides fertile ground for reactive antagonism in Japan against China and South Korea. So this evil cycle of enmity reproduction, I think, makes it very difficult for Sino-Japanese and Korean-Japanese discourse to go away. As we all know, a wide range of friendly overtures are being made between China and Japan and between Japan and South Korea in recent years. But the question is, are they really strategic? Are they really going to be permanent, or are they going to be merely tactical in nature? That question is important because the strategic matrix in North Asia is evolving. That is to say, if the strategic matrix in Northeast Asia were to be restructured as a sort of confrontational one between the maritime coalition versus continental coalition, then I would say there would be very little room, if any, available for genuine reconciliation. In the long run, despite China's expectations and wishes, uncertainties associated with the rise of China, or the future of China, are bound to exacerbate China's ties with Japan as well as with South Korea. Let me talk a little bit about the new scars in the making. By that, I refer to the Sino-South Korean history controversy. Before the 21st century, I would say Japan used to enjoy the monopoly over the history controversy. But not anymore. China has entered into the race. China defined all nations in histories and dynasties that took place within the current territorial jurisdiction of the PLC as belonging to Chinese history. And one notable victim of that is South Korea, others being Mongolia, Vietnam, Turkey, and so on and so forth. The basic problem, I think, with the new approach in China is that it totally denies the place of Goguryeo in Korean history. There are basically three schools of thought in China regarding Goguryeo, but the most recent one, the third school, which is often called the Northeast School, totally denies the place of Goguryeo in Korean history. I think that is very wrong. Of course, as Professor Baker mentioned, 1400 years ago, there was no one Korean nation. But that doesn't mean that that area belonged to China. So I guess the second school of thought in China, which is usually one history, dual use school, makes sense, although I'm not sure whether ultra-nationalist Korean historians will accept it. But there is room for reconciliation, but that is not going to happen. And also, even if the Northeast project began as a purely scholarly project, as Chinese claim, the possibility of the Chinese government exploiting this new window of opportunity cannot be totally precluded. So I would say if there are genuine NGOs in China or conscientious scholars in China who still believe there must be room for the Koguryeo in Korean history, that voice should be heard. So when it comes to regional integration and regionalism, people are always reminded of the experiences of Europe and Southeast Asia, but not Northeast Asia. There are many discourses and viewpoints on East Asian regionalism. The engine has usually come from Southeast Asia, the ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, East Asian Summit, and so on. But in fact, Northeast Asia, that is China, Japan, South Korea, has been sort of bandwagoning with Southeast Asia under the convenient banner of non-traditional security. But given the old wounds and new scars in the making, particularly associated with the history issue, Northeast Asia, in my view, is not well positioned to come out of this long stalemate, some interesting recent overtures notwithstanding. In this region, I think history has repeatedly shown the identity-related issue are the most explosive of all. The demise of the Cold War put these traditional issues on the forefront, introducing the most destabilizing factors to world politics. The issues of free trade agreements, so many countries and so many business communities are yearning for, did not work. Not only because of the inherent economic reasons, but also because of this history-related political problems. In conclusion, if the past century is any practical guide, Sino-Japanese rivalry is here to stay, unfortunately, and little can be done to eliminate or fundamentally eradicate the root of the problem, that is mutual suspicion between the two giants. The fundamental security dilemma of the region is not likely to evaporate, in my view. The clash of historiographies and other security-related dilemmas, such as the rise of China and the North Korean problem, will add to the uncertain regional order and the formation in Northeast Asia. In my view, although NGOs or conscientious scholarship is important, but most important, I would say, is a political determination and regional leadership. Only with those two, I think this daunting challenge can be overcome. But such leadership, equipped with determination, comes only at a premium, and it's very hard to come by. I know it is customary to provide an optimistic note in this kind of occasion, but overall, my tone was cautiously pessimistic. Then again, I will be happy to be proven wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we've had a hopeful discussion of two ideas for bridging differences and a less hopeful explanation of how international relations may be driving national identities and history discussions into even more negative ground. And in this discussion, we've heard of the shift, really, from Japan as the focus of the old wounds to China as the source of new scars. We also have heard that we have political leadership sometimes having at least as much impact as forces, the NGOs, and the forces from below, the democratization that also were explained as important in driving some of the shifts we are observing. There's a lot of food for thought, and I hope we have a lively discussion to follow. We turn now to our third presenter, Professor Soya Yoshida from Keio University.
Thank you, Gil. I'd like to thank the Jeju Peace Forum organizers for inviting me back to this very extensive three-day discussion this year. When I got the invitation this year, I hesitated a bit, largely because of the subject. but not because of the reasons which used to be the case for a Japanese to appear in this kind of forum. In the end, I hope my kind of sense of reservation will be conveyed to you as a source of discussion. I will try to be as blunt as possible and provocative, perhaps, but again, in a very different way than what is considered to be provocative coming from a Japanese mouth. First, I outlaid 5 central characteristics of the Japanese, the rise of Japanese political conservatism, and I'm not defining the concept academically. I'm just talking about critical features, what I see as critical features of political conservatism in Japan, particularly in connection with the issue of history. And my kind of central point, number 1, is basic motives or emotional urges of those who make these conservative arguments in Japan are largely domestic. Basically, inward comes from their definitions of domestic issues. And not much implication as far as their arguments per se are concerned for Japan's foreign policy options. And so this is maybe one of the difficult gaps which exist between Japan and the outside observers when it comes to this issue, because there is a strong tendency to interpret the nature of changes happening today as well as the future direction of Japanese foreign policies just straight out of their discourses. And this linear projection of possible future of Japan from their arguments, I think, is a non-starter as an analysis of Japan, as an analysis of the nature of political conservatism in Japan. So maybe that's the second point, which I'd like to stress toward the end of my presentation. So implications of that for international relations in East Asia would be, to the extent Japanese politics becoming hostage to the rise of political conservatism, Japan will perhaps remain largely irrelevant, if not a source of instability or anything of that sort. And so that leads me to the final point which I like to make is what is then a possible way out of this situation from Japanese point of view. And firstly,